The rain hammered against the tin roof of the small garage in rural Pennsylvania as James Crawford wiped grease from his weathered hands. At 73 years old, he moved slower than he used to, but his mind remained sharp as the day he first enlisted. The old British 25-pounder artillery piece sat in the corner of his workshop, covered in dust and cobwebs, a relic most people would dismiss as scrap metal. His grandson, Tyler, had driven up from Philadelphia that October morning, camera equipment filling the trunk of his sedan. Tyler was working on a documentary project for his graduate program at Temple University, focusing on forgotten weapons of World War II. He had called his grandfather 3 weeks earlier, excited about interviewing veterans and examining historical artillery pieces. Now, standing in that cramped garage in Lancaster County, Tyler circled the massive gun with his camera, disappointment evident on his face. "This is it? This is what you wanted me to see? The thing looks ancient. I was hoping for something more impressive like a German 88 or one of those Soviet Katyushas." James said nothing at first. He simply pulled a faded photograph from his jacket pocket and placed it on his workbench. The black and white image showed a young man, barely recognizable as the elderly veteran before him, standing beside the same artillery piece in the muddy fields of Normandy, June 1944. Tyler picked up the photograph, studying it more carefully. "That's you? You served with the British?" "American liaison officer," James replied quietly. "Attached to the British 7th Armored Division right after D-Day. I was assigned to coordinate between American infantry and British artillery units during the push inland. That's where I met this beauty, and that's where I learned why the Germans feared it more than anything else we threw at them." Tyler's skepticism remained visible. "Grandpa, no offense, but this gun was designed in the 1930s. By the time you guys landed in Normandy, it was already outdated. The Germans had superior range, better armor penetration, more advanced targeting systems. I've read the specifications. This 25-pounder was practically obsolete." James smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing something others cannot understand through books or statistics. "Son, you're looking at numbers on paper. I'm talking about what I saw with my own eyes, what I lived through. This gun right here saved my life and the lives of hundreds of men I served with. And it broke the spirit of German divisions that thought they were invincible." He walked over to the artillery piece and ran his hand along the barrel, decades of memories flooding back. "Let me tell you something they don't teach in your fancy university programs. War isn't won by the most advanced technology. It's won by the weapons soldiers can actually use when everything goes to hell." And in the chaos of occupied Europe, this supposedly outdated British gun became the most feared piece of artillery the Germans ever faced. Tyler lowered his camera, his journalist instincts finally kicking in. He pulled out his notebook and recording equipment. "Okay, I'm listening. What made it so special?" James settled into his old workshop chair, the springs creaking under his weight. "First, you need to understand what we were up against. After we broke through the beaches, every hedgerow in Normandy became a fortress. The Germans were dug in deep with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and their own artillery batteries positioned to tear us apart. They had home field advantage, better positions, and they fought like cornered animals. Our American artillery was good. Don't get me wrong. The 105mm howitzer was reliable and powerful. But it was slow. Setting up positions, adjusting fire, moving to new locations, it all took time we didn't have. The Germans would hit us, then disappear before we could return effective fire. We were getting chewed up, losing men every day to artillery strikes we couldn't answer fast enough. That's when I got assigned to work with the British 7th Armored. They called themselves the Desert Rats, veterans of North Africa who had fought Rommel himself. And they swore by their 25-pounders like Americans swear by their football teams. I thought they were crazy at first. I had seen the technical specifications just like you. I knew this gun was older, had less range, couldn't punch through heavy armor like our bigger guns could. But then I saw them in action and everything changed." Tyler leaned forward, the documentary footage temporarily forgotten. "What happened?" James's eyes grew distant, seeing scenes from 8 decades ago as clearly as if they had happened yesterday. "It was 3 days after I joined their unit. We were pushing toward Cannes, trying to take the city before the Germans could reinforce their positions. Our column got ambushed in an open field, German 88s and mortars raining down on us from concealed positions in the tree line. We lost 2 Sherman tanks in the first 30 seconds. Men were screaming, diving for cover, complete chaos. The British artillery officer, a captain named Reynolds, didn't panic like I expected. He didn't waste time with elaborate calculations or wait for perfect coordinates. He just started barking orders to his crew, and those men moved like a machine. Within 90 seconds, that 25-pounder was unlimbered, aimed, and firing. 90 seconds, Tyler. From traveling position to first shot in 90 seconds. Our American crews needed 5 to 7 minutes minimum to set up and start firing accurately. The Germans needed even longer with their heavier guns. But these British crews, they had drilled so relentlessly that setting up that gun was like breathing to them. The first shell screamed overhead and impacted near the German position. Not a direct hit, but close enough. Reynolds adjusted, called out new coordinates, and the crew fired again. 15 seconds between shots. Then another. Then another. Within 2 minutes of that first round, they had found the range and were pounding the German battery into silence. But it wasn't just the speed that impressed me. It was what happened next that made me understand why the Germans feared this weapon. The moment the enemy artillery went quiet, Reynolds ordered his crew to pack up. They had that entire gun limbered and ready to move in under 2 minutes. Before the Germans could reorganize and return fire on their position, the British were already gone, setting up 300 yards away to support our infantry advance. I had never seen anything like it. The versatility was incredible. That same gun could fire high-explosive shells for artillery support, armor-piercing rounds against tanks, smoke rounds for cover, even anti-aircraft rounds if needed. One weapon system, multiple roles, and a crew that could switch between them without missing a beat. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched those 25-pounder crews perform miracles. They would leapfrog positions, always moving, never staying still long enough for German counter-battery fire to find them. They could set up in impossible locations, tight village streets, forest clearings, even inside partially destroyed buildings. The gun was light enough to maneuver by hand if needed, but powerful enough to break German defensive positions. The Germans started calling it the Devil's Hammer in their radio communications. We intercepted their transmissions, heard their officers warning about British artillery in the area. They feared it more than our heavy bombers, more than our tank columns, because they never knew where it would strike next or how quickly it would disappear. But I didn't truly understand the psychological impact until we reached a small village called Tilly-sur-Seulles. That's where everything went wrong, and where I learned that even the most feared weapon means nothing if the men using it break under pressure. We walked into a trap that would test everything those British crews had learned in years of combat. The village looked abandoned when we rolled in that gray morning. Stone houses with shuttered windows lined narrow streets barely wide enough for our vehicles. Captain Reynolds didn't like it. I could see it in the way he kept scanning the rooftops, his jaw clenched tight. Something's off, he muttered to me. Too quiet. He was right. The Germans had let us push deep into the village center before they sprang the trap. Machine gun fire erupted from every direction simultaneously. Windows that appeared empty suddenly blazed with muzzle flashes. Mortars started dropping among our scattered vehicles. They had planned this perfectly, turned the entire village into a killing box. Our infantry tried to fall back, but the Germans had blocked the main road behind us with a destroyed truck. We were pinned down, taking casualties, and the radio chatter was pure chaos. American commanders were screaming for artillery support, for airstrikes, for anything that could break the German ambush before we were wiped out completely. But our heavy artillery was miles behind us, still setting up in positions near the last village we had captured. Air support was grounded by the low cloud cover. We were on our own, and the Germans knew it. I could hear their officers shouting orders, coordinating their fire, moving to finish us off. That's when Reynolds made a decision that seemed insane. He ordered his 25-pounder crews to set up right there in the village square, in the middle of the firefight, with German bullets ricocheting off the cobblestones around them. His sergeant looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Sir, we'll be exposed." They'll tear us apart before we get off a single shot. Reynolds's response was ice cold. Then we better work faster than we ever have before. Get that gun operational now. If you're watching this story and wondering how these men found the courage to face impossible odds, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. What happens next changed everything, and you won't want to miss how this supposedly outdated weapon turned the tide of battle. The British crews moved with a speed that defied belief. Even with bullets snapping past their heads, even with wounded men screaming around them, they worked with mechanical precision. The gun came off its limber. The trails dug into the cobblestones. The barrel swung toward the nearest German position. But setting up the gun was the easy part. What Reynolds ordered them to do next violated every rule of artillery warfare I had ever learned. He was going to use the 25-pounder in direct fire mode, shooting at targets he could see with his own eyes, at point-blank range by artillery standards. The gun wasn't designed for that kind of combat. It was supposed to lob shells from miles away, not engage in street fighting like a tank. The first shot from the 25-pounder at close range was like thunder trapped between the stone buildings. The high-explosive shell hit a German machine gun nest in a second-story window, and the entire corner of that building disintegrated in a shower of brick and timber. The German gun went silent instantly. Reynolds didn't celebrate. He was already calling out the next target, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity. Building on the left, ground floor, 2 o'clock. The crew swung the barrel, loaded, and fired in less than 20 seconds. Another direct hit. Another German position destroyed. What I witnessed in the next 15 minutes redefined everything I thought I knew about artillery. The 25-pounder became a street-fighting weapon, blasting German positions at ranges so close I could see the enemy soldiers scrambling to escape before the shells hit. The British crews worked with a synchronization that seemed superhuman, each man knowing exactly what the others needed before words were spoken. The Germans tried to focus their fire on the gun position, but Reynolds had positioned it with calculated genius. The stone fountain in the village square provided partial cover, and the angle of the streets made it difficult for German mortars to get a direct line of sight. Every time the enemy tried to maneuver for a better shot, the 25-pounder would pivot and unleash another devastating blast. But the real turning point came when a German Panzer IV tank rumbled into the square from a side street, its 75mm gun swinging toward our position. A tank versus an artillery piece at 50 yards. In any normal situation, we were dead. Tanks were designed for this kind of close combat. Artillery wasn't. Reynolds never hesitated. Armor-piercing now. His loader slammed the round home while the gunner adjusted aim. The German tank fired first, its shell screaming past and demolishing the wall behind us. Stone fragments tore through the air like shrapnel. The 25-pounder fired a fraction of a second later. The armor-piercing round punched through the Panzer's front armor at nearly point-blank range and detonated inside. The tank shuddered, smoke pouring from every hatch, and ground to a halt. The crew bailed out, running for cover as flames began to consume their vehicle. That single shot broke the German defense. Seeing their tank destroyed by what they thought was just a support weapon shattered their confidence. The machine gun fire became sporadic, desperate. Their mortar crews started pulling back. Within minutes, the coordinated ambush dissolved into a chaotic retreat. Our infantry seized the moment and pushed forward, clearing buildings with renewed aggression. The Germans fled the village, leaving behind weapons, ammunition, and wounded. The trap they had set so carefully had been turned against them by a supposedly outdated artillery piece and a crew that refused to accept the limitations everyone said existed. The silence after the battle felt heavier than the gunfire had been. Smoke drifted through the village square, mixing with the morning fog. The 25-pounder sat amid the rubble, its barrel still hot, surrounded by empty shell casings that littered the cobblestones like brass flowers. Reynolds finally allowed himself to breathe. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline fading and reality setting in. 3 of his crew had been wounded, none critically, but enough to remind everyone how close they had come to total annihilation. The medics worked quickly, applying bandages and administering morphine, while the rest of us secured the village perimeter. I approached Reynolds as he supervised his men preparing to move out. They never stopped, these British crews. Even after a battle like that, they were already thinking about the next position, the next fight. "Captain," I said, trying to find words adequate for what I had witnessed. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in combat." He looked at me with exhausted eyes, then at his gun, then back at me. "This is why we trust the 25-pounder, Lieutenant Crawford. Not because it's the most powerful or the most advanced. Because when everything goes wrong, when you're surrounded and outgunned and everyone thinks you're finished, this gun keeps fighting. And more importantly, the crews who operate it know they can depend on it absolutely." Over the following months, as we pushed deeper into France and eventually into Germany itself, I saw that scene repeated in dozens of variations. The 25-pounder became legendary among both Allied and German forces. Intelligence reports we captured showed German officers specifically warning their troops about British artillery positions, instructing them to withdraw immediately if 25-pounders were identified in their sector. The Americans started requesting British artillery support for critical operations, something that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Generals who had dismissed the 25-pounder as outdated began asking why we didn't have something similar. The answer was simple but difficult to accept. We had focused on individual weapon superiority while the British had focused on crew training, tactical flexibility, and speed of deployment. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the 25-pounder had fired more rounds than any other artillery piece in the European theater. It had served in every major campaign from North Africa to the Rhine crossing. It had destroyed thousands of enemy positions, knocked out hundreds of tanks, and saved countless Allied lives. But more than the statistics, it had earned something that no technical specification could measure: the absolute trust of the men who used it and the deep fear of the men who faced it. In the chaos and brutality of war, that trust and fear meant everything. Captain Reynolds survived the war and returned to England. We wrote letters for years afterward, comparing our civilian lives to those desperate days in Normandy. He never forgot his gun, and neither did I. Tyler set down his notebook, his perspective completely transformed. The dusty artillery piece in the corner of the garage no longer looked like obsolete scrap metal. It looked like a monument to courage, ingenuity, and the men who had trusted their lives to it. "Grandpa, how did you end up with this specific gun? How did it get here to Pennsylvania?" James smiled, the memories still vivid after all these years. After the war ended, the British were decommissioning thousands of these guns. Most were sold for scrap or given to Allied nations. Captain Reynolds knew how much this particular gun meant to me, the one that saved us in Tilly-sur-Seulles. He pulled strings, called in favors, navigated mountains of military bureaucracy. In 1947, this gun was officially transferred to the United States as a gift between Allied veterans. It arrived at the port of Philadelphia, and I drove down to collect it personally. For decades, it sat in my backyard, a reminder of what I had lived through. Neighbors thought I was crazy, keeping an artillery piece like a garden ornament. But every time I looked at it, I remembered Reynolds and his crew, their faces, their voices, their unshakable determination. I remembered the men who died and the men who survived because this gun kept firing when everything else failed. Tyler stood and approached the 25-pounder with new reverence, running his hand along the same barrel his grandfather had touched moments earlier. "This changes my entire documentary. This isn't just about forgotten weapons. It's about why some weapons are remembered and others aren't. It's about the difference between technical superiority and battlefield effectiveness." James nodded slowly. "That's exactly right, son. The Germans had superior technology in many areas. Their tanks had better armor and bigger guns. Their artillery had longer range. But they lost the war. You know why? Because war isn't fought in laboratories or on specification sheets. It's fought by exhausted men in terrible conditions who need weapons they can depend on absolutely. The 25-pounder was that weapon. Over the next 3 months, Tyler completed his documentary. It featured extensive interviews with his grandfather, historical footage, and interviews with British veterans who had served with 25-pounder crews. The film won awards at multiple university competitions and eventually caught the attention of military historians and documentary producers. The 25-pounder in James's garage became a local landmark. Schools brought students to see it and hear James's stories. Veterans organizations held memorial services around it. It was eventually donated to the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where it remains on display today, restored to its wartime configuration. James Crawford passed away in 2003 at the age of 82. At his funeral, attended by family, friends, and veterans from 3 different wars, a British artillery crew performed a ceremonial gun salute using a restored 25-pounder. The sound echoed across the Pennsylvania countryside, a final tribute to a man who had learned that true effectiveness comes not from being the newest or most advanced, but from being reliable when everything else fails.